I was reading an article about a woman who had some issues feeding her child after childbirth, and it caused me to kind of look into this topic a little more because it's very common. I myself have had some issues feeding my children after birth, and I wanted to know what women did in the 18th century when they had these same issues. What I found was women used a lot of different things to feed their children, from empty horns to glasses to the creation of a bottle, which at first was very unsanitary and caused high infant mortality rates. Another used method would be to employ a wet nurse. So today I'm going to talk to you guys about why women opted out and how they chose their wet nurse. So, first of all, a wet nurse is a woman who takes on the job of feeding another woman's child. In this case, the wet nurse would have to have had a child 6 months to a year prior to taking on the job. Women who were able to pick their wet nurses typically were of nobility or royal, some type of royalty. These women would choose to opt out for, yes, the obvious reasons. They were not able to, or maybe passed away during childbirth, different things like that, similar to today. But another reason for them not to feed their child would be just to simply opt out. A common reason for nobility was that women's role was to produce more children. So, with that being said, they didn't have time to mother their child, especially if their firstborn, was a girl. It was very important for them to have a boy to pass on the name. So, in that case, you would employ a wet nurse so that you can get yourself back in order and go back in to produce an heir to the throne. Wet nurses would typically move in with the family that has employed them or just live very close so that the mother could visit her child from time to time, so that way whatever the mother wanted to instill in the child would be, but the child would be raised by the wet nurse typically until about feeding age, so 2 to 3 years old. And then the child would move back with the mother, and the wet nurse can go on to the next family. Wet nurses were picked a few different ways. One of the ways that I thought was interesting was a milk check. They felt the need to make sure that the milk was just right. So they wanted it to be not too thick, not too thin, somewhere in the middle. And the way that they would do that is they would have a fingernail and they would drop some of the milk onto the fingernail. So it was believed that if the drop went down too fast, it's a no go. And on the flip side, if the drop lingered too long, it was a no go. So it had to be somewhere in the middle. I'm not sure how you can really guess that, but that's what they did. Another thing would be to really look at the mother's diet and also her temperament. It was also a belief that the mother's demeanor, or I'm sorry, the wet nurse's demeanor would be carried on through the child through the breast milk. So they wanted someone of, just calm, nice tempered person to kind of feed their child. And they would go through all of those criteria with women. In some of cases with the wet nurses, after a certain point in time, it did become kind of a career for some women. So the criteria became a little bit more strict. One of which would be they wanted the most previous child that you had to have been a boy. And those women would then go through the pool of being employed by a wet nurse. So today I have talked to you about women in the 18th century, how they chose their wet nurses, and why they chose their wet nurses. Wet nurses, like how I previously stated, had to have previously had a child within 6 months to a year, which means that they would have to stop feeding their own child in order to take on the task of feeding another woman's child. And if you ask me, that's the most selfless thing that someone can do, is to put your child on the back burner to take on the duty of caring for another one's child who doesn't or can't be cared for by their own parent. So the next time that you are feeding your niece, your nephew, daughter, son, cousin, just think about all of these other women who helped people in need. Thank you.